Today's video will take a look at tanking for Black Fathom Deeps and some general tips for each boss. This was taken from a recent lockout we did as a guild, so there are room for improvements obviously, but after some blood, sweat, and tears we were able to finally kill Kelris, after several close attempts and 50 plus shadow protection potions across the raid. This should be an extremely hot take, but like most people have agreed, Kelris is the hardest boss of the raid and your chances of success go way down in the final 35% burn phase if you do not have a shadow protection potion and spread out so the chains hit minimal people for dispel and healing reasons. Our runes for this raid were Master Channeler for the chest, Metamorphosis for gloves, and then we switched between Incinerate and Demonic Embrace depending on the fight. Starting out with our general rotation tips. For single target rotation, if you have the Incinerate rune, you'll start by opening up Incinerate, then cast Immolate, Curse of Agony, Corruption, Drain Life, and then fill with Searing Pain till it's time to refresh either Immolate, Curse of Agony, Corruption, or Drain Life. Life tapping as the fight allows. If you don't have the Incinerate rune, then start off with Immolate, Curse of Agony, Corruption, Drain Life, and fill with Searing Pains. If you get a clear chance to cast Incinerate after the opener, like a phase change or a taunt swap where the boss goes into an animation, you should take it, but because it's such a long cast time, you'll gain more threat per second mashing Searing Pain in its place for the normal rotation. For AoE, we had good success starting off with Immolate and Curse of Agony or Corruption on our main tank target, then tab targeting all the others with our instant cast Shadow Dots and adding in the new Shadow Cleave when they were all grouped up. This is mainly important when taking heavy trash pulls or big ad fights like the Lorgus Jett Warlock Gauntlet, but if it's a real big pull, you should remember that you also have an AoE taunt that's on a 10-minute cooldown. I did end up using it once or twice during the Gauntlet boss to keep the Murlocs off the healers and grouped up initially as well. You'll also want to use your defensive cooldowns as needed. Demonic Embrace, if you took it, is a 20-second cooldown ability that costs 0 mana, so if you have it, mash it for maximum upkeep. However, just so you know, your pet does need to be alive, so if you have sacrificed your Voidwalker for a shield, you will lose the ability to cast Demonic Embrace until you cast another pet. However, if sacrificing your Voidwalker to get a shield allows you to soak a mechanic or survive another hit, then you need to do what you need to do to keep yourself alive. Same with health stones and health potions. Always also have Master Channeler drain life up at every chance you can get. For pet choices, if you're needing to enhance your survivability or add heavy fight like Lorgus, then take Demonic Embrace and have a Voidwalker out. You need more DPS, then take the Incinerate rune and the Succubus. And lastly, for some hybrid attack, Demonic Embrace will give you your Succubus a nice boost in crit chance every 20 seconds while also letting you dodge attacks more easily for 6 seconds. However, this is useless against caster heavy bosses like Kelris since the vast majority of his damage is magic, which can't be dodged. Moving on to the boss fights now, and starting with Baron Aquanis. For Baron Aquanis, this fight only really requires one tank. However, having two isn't a bad idea if people can't stay up on the platforms. This is actually our second time tanking Baron, and unfortunately we can't really say for sure how to avoid the knockbacks yet, as everyone is still learning to look for the debuff to move away from the group, or if you're in melee, anticipating his 360 bubble knockback. Honestly, as you can see from the footage though, despite everyone getting knocked off, the boss was a pushover and both times we one-shot it. DPS locks just pump and try and get out of the AoE storm whenever it shows up. Ghamoo-ra is the next boss, and you'll definitely want to tank him in the center after clearing all mobs off the island. Please be aware of where Ghamoo-ra is as he swims in a circle around the island, and you don't want to body pull him crossing over to the island if possible. As a boss, it is a relative tank and spank with the only two mechanics you need to be worried about, which are your back's positioning to the bubbles when they're spawned, and the threat drop when he slams you back into a knockback. Just try to make sure your back is to as few of the bubbles as possible before the knockback happens, and have an off tank pick him up till you can get back to the center and regain aggro, or if you're doing a tank swap strategy, just building aggro for the next threat drop knockback. Rinse repeat until it dies. As a DPS, you may want to take damage for one bubble to get mana back to save global cooldowns on life tap, but it is a very high risk, high reward option because they do a lot of damage to you if you touch them, and it will only take 2 to 3 to kill you. Lady Sarevess is a weird encounter, to be honest, and we did it a little differently than most guides would recommend. Our strategy was to have one tank on the ad while the DPS burned it down originally, while the other tank did his absolute best to corral Lady Sarevess until the ad died, in between her focus target phases. After the first ad was dead, all DPS focused on the boss and left any ads that spawned beyond that point to the ad tank. Small tips: she will attack you for the duration of your taunt, even if she is focused on someone else. However, after about 2 or 3 seconds, she will switch back to whatever target she is focusing for the target phase. Also, the ads have an range timer, so if you aren't able to DPS Lady Sarevess down before even one ad enrages, you will probably ripe, which is the reason we had to kill the first ad before focusing Lady Sarevess, as the ad would actually enrage before we could focus the boss down. Gelihast is a 3-phase 2-tank fight, as well as supposedly a DPS check for the rest of the raid. For all phases as a tank, you will need to swap off each other with around 2 to 3 Shadow Strike stacks, because otherwise the damage going out will become almost unhealable. Also, if you're a DPS on this boss, avoid the Shadow Crashes, but as a tank you shouldn't need to worry about them except during the inner phases when the little Murlocs spawn. 2 times, Gelihast will heal 10% back to full health, and while he is doing that, a little Bullet Hell Murloc minigame will start where you'll need to avoid the Shadow Crashes and Murlocs, and it only ends when he is healed back to full health. During phase 2 for tanks, it's basically just more of the same, taunt off each other around 2 to 3 Shadow Strikes, then another inner phase of Murlocs and Shadow Crashes, and in phase 3, again, tanks just need to keep tanking Gelihast and taunting off each other at the appropriate stacks. However, in phase 3 for DPS, much like on Lady Sarevess, there will be tentacles that spawn, and you will want to burn down the initial round of tentacles, then focus only the boss, ignoring any additional tentacle spawns beyond that point. Defeating this boss will unlock a repair vendor and teleportation stone so that you can teleport from the entrance to that new location and vice versa. That is a gauntlet style boss after Gelihast. We recommend having the melee tank on priestesses and the caster tanks on the elites to avoid disarms and mana drains. The key though to the gauntlet is that every time you kill a priestess, it'll trigger the next room. So we found our best strategy was to focus the elites, clean up Murlocs, and then kill priestess. Rinse repeating, clearing all the ads before activating the final room with Lorgus Jett. The boss itself is possibly a 1-tank fight, if DPS respect the lightning shield totem, but for most of the fight, until about 20%, we killed both the Molten Fury and lightning shield totems, while DPSing the boss only during the Wind Fury totem phase. The timing of the totems is roughly 10 seconds apart, and it will always go Wind Fury, Molten Fury, Lightning Shield. Again, we cannot emphasize enough how important it is for everyone to stop DPS on the boss when Lightning Shield goes off, even tanks, because of how much reflect damage it does. Lastly, we also found it super helpful to slowly kite the boss up and down the gauntlet area to space the totems out and keep people from grouping up and taking damage from the Molten Fury. Lord Kelris, to be frank, is just a stupid boss. We actually had to switch the group comp up just a little bit because our DPS wasn't up to snuff, so I was actually fire DPS on our kill. However, I tanked several attempts that got him down to 1%, so we do have a few general tanking tips. As a tank, you just have to try to keep aggro on the boss and try to be at max melee range to be not sucked into the portals unless you've been assigned a time to be sucked into the portals. Also, be ready to readjust the boss away from the purple Shadow Crash scoop that's being left on the floor, as it will slowly expand if they aren't clearing the dream fast enough when they're sent in. Our group's DPS was getting between 3 and 4 portals before the 35% phase, depending on how quickly RNGS gave us the exit. Ideally, you would not have tanks going in at all, but melee seems to be able to clear the priestesses a bit faster than casters. But more importantly, melee need to be interrupting Kelris' cast as often as possible to keep the tank down, damage on the tank down as much as possible. So it's a fine line to walk. However, if you are a DPS lock and are selected to clear in the portals, we found a dot or two with wanding allows you to conserve a good portion of your mana while still clearing at a decent rate with your partner. The last part of the portal mechanic is once you have cleared a dream, you cannot go back into a dream. So you have to send in groups of people every time it goes through. Otherwise, it'll be selected with the 2 closest people to the boss. Moving back to tanking though, since I was the second tank, I went in our first portal phase so I could take over tanking for when the fight's main tank went in our third portal phase. At 35% phase change happens, all hell breaks loose and you better have a shadow protection potion to pop. Just try to survive both either as a DPS or a tank, dealing as much damage as possible as fast as possible. You also want to try and be at max melee range, spread out as much as possible in the introduction to the phase change, so that way you will minimize the amount of change damage you tank when you cast it, because it's like a chain lightning effect, dealing more damage the amount of times it hits a target, and it jumps between targets. We personally have seen them retune this fight to not rely on consumables in the future, but for now, the only time we even got close to clearing it was when we sent people back to get everyone a shadow protection potion. Your mileage may vary. Ghamoo-ra, the final boss, and ironically vastly easier than Kelris despite being the final boss, only requires one tank for the first 50%. So for the first 50%, I mostly just did damage with my dots, immolate, incinerate, and biding my time. However, if you are the main tank in this fight, for the first 50%, you will want to face the boss away from the raid and have everybody stand behind him because he sends out a stacking poison debuff and a cone AoE that takes roughly 3 seconds to cast that he will periodically target and cast on a random person in the raid. So if people get hit by this, they will not only take a stacking poison debuff, but when that debuff is dispelled, you will actually spawn a little poison bubble ad. So this is really important because you want to have the tank only be the one getting these poison debuffs, and he will periodically take the boss over to an elemental and cleanse those debuffs off. And when that happens, the little elementals corrupt. You can't use that elemental again to clear your poison debuff for the rest of the fight. And then, of course, the ad bubbles spawn. So you'll want to take and kill those ad bubbles before refocusing on the boss. At 50%, a phase change happens, and you'll need 2 tanks to finish the fight. In this phase, Aquanis will apply a stacking debuff that lowers your max HP every time you take a hit from it. So, every 1 to 2 times it's cast on your tank, you'll need to swap over and let your tank hit it until, again, they take the debuff, and keep going back and forth until you unfortunately either die or kill the boss. And during this phase, you will ignore pretty much everything and just focus the boss entirely and burn him down as fast as possible. And with that, hopefully there are some tips and tricks, strategies that you can incorporate into your own raids to help them clear them more efficiently and faster. If you like the video, why not give it a thumbs up and possibly our channel a sub. Have a good night.